I remind those of you new to my channel, what is a study? A study or a composition is a position that was invented, as you can imagine, a position that was invented by somebody, not from an actual over-the-board game. And in studies, first of all, it's always white to play, so you always look at it from white's point of view. That's just convention. And studies can come in two types. There could be ones that require you to make a draw with best play. And then there are studies where you have to win. So with best play by both you and your opponent, white wins. What is even the point of studies? Well, studies are supposed to be beautiful. So really good studies feature themes and patterns and variations that rarely occur in over-the-board chess. And the best studies are tremendously beautiful. There's many different kinds of themes, many kinds of studies. But the point is that the solution in a study has to be somewhat forced. It doesn't have to be literally forced, but it has to be solvable by a human. It can't just be a random position. The main line has to be relatively clear. So in this study by a guy named Matus, who was a famous composer, this was composed around the 1970s, I think. It is white to play and win with best play. White wins the game with best play. Okay? So let's figure out what's going on here. White's pawns are going this way. First of all, white is down 2 pawns. And just looking at the position, you might see that white has a couple of tempting checks. White also can capture black's knight. So let's start with this move. What just happens if white captures black's knight? You might notice here that if black simply recaptures the pawn, remember that queen and bishop versus queen, even with no pawns, is a draw in most cases. But here white has bishop e7 check, and because of the pin, the king has to move and loses the queen. But the problem is that black can actually give a check on e6, driving the king out, and then take on g6 with check, and this is just a draw. Black has 3 pawns for the piece, and the king is not going to be able to evade perpetual check. And even if it does, black doesn't even need to give a check. You can just move the king up to g7. So that doesn't work. You could also try g takes h7. You might say, oh, well, the king is not able to stop the pawn. Unfortunately, the bishop is hanging with check. And here black is actually winning. So that doesn't work either. A third tempting move is queen to d6 check. And this is what most people think the solution is initially. Well, if g takes f7, then queen takes f7 and black is okay. G takes h7 looks like it checkmates. Because after king takes h7, white has a very pretty checkmating sequence. Who sees it? And who sees the flaw in this? Why is this not winning by force? Yeah, queen d6 is wrong. Yeah, if you look at the whole board, you'll see the queen drops back to h2, then up to g3, then mates on g7. Nothing spectacular, but it's winning. Unfortunately, the king can hide behind the pawn on h8. White is out of checks. And black is threatening to trade queens and make a draw with queen e6 check. There's just no... And this is computer check. There's no way to win here. If Stephen's 11th. So neither of those moves work. The correct move is not a check and it is not a capture. But clearly, by process of elimination, the correct move has to defend the bishop. And it has to defend the e6 square. Or maybe not. But at the very least, it has to defend the bishop. Well, if g7, then king g8, and again... the checks are extinguished. So the correct move, Frost, got it, queen c8. Not only does this defend the bishop, it also threatens bishop to e7 check, which, as we already know, wins the queen. Now, what about queen e6 check, you might ask? Doesn't this trade queens and make a draw? Well, no. This position, white takes on h7, and on the next move, white promotes with mate. Because the knight, black's knight, is what kills him here. Okay. Well, does black have any defense to bishop e7 check? Does anybody see black's defense? And part of study solving involves finding the best defense. That's called the counterplay. In studies, it's not enough to just solve it from the winning side. You have to fully understand how the opponent is going to react most resiliently. King g8. The king escapes the check on e7. Okay. Now comes the amazing part of the study. So we need to figure out what to do here. Again, g takes h7, as we already know, doesn't lead anywhere due to king h8. G takes f7. Also, queen takes f7. That's check. So here is where you really have to think outside the box and find a beautiful idea. It's not that there's no logic to the correct move, but it is really, really hard to spot this idea if you're not an experienced study solver. So when you are stumped and you're in the critical position, one question that you can often ask yourself is, well, what moves am I ruling out just because they look ridiculous? Like, what category of moves am I not even considering? And then to take a look at those various moves. Well, that category is probably moving the bishop, right? You're probably not thinking about moving the bishop because it blunders the queen. Why would we do that? And it doesn't seem like it could possibly be checkmate because the king always has h8 as a retreating square. Yeah, but young chess kind of got it. Well, a lot of you are suggesting king g5. I don't get this move, folks, because black can just take the pawn. You're not creating any threats. So let's consider a random bishop move. Let's consider bishop takes a5 for a second. Let's think about that for just a second. Well, after queen takes c8, g takes f7 check, you might notice something really interesting. You might say, wait a second. If the king goes to f8, we actually deliver checkmate on b4. The king has to go to h8. And that king is awfully boxed in. And it would be very nice if we had this retreat back to c3, which would threaten a discovered mate against the king. The queen seems to be stuck to the f8 square. If the queen moves anywhere, we promote with checkmate. Well, what's the problem with this specific execution? What's the problem with this specific execution? It's check. The queen takes the bishop with check. But part of study solving involves spotting the right idea and then modifying it to suit your needs. So maybe we don't need to take the pawn. Maybe we need to bring the bishop somewhere such that it can land on this diagonal without being threatened by black's queen. So let's consider bishop c7. Well, if knight takes c7, then there's g takes f7 check, winning the game. So black has to go down this path. Takes, gf. By the way, bishop b6 doesn't work because after queen takes c8, gf, black has king f8, and the c5 square is unfortunately covered. So bishop c7 is really the only way to get the bishop onto that diagonal. King h8, bishop e5. And if you adjust your eyes to this position, you'll actually see that it seems like there is no defense to the threat of the king stepping aside with checkmate. If the h-pawn moves to get the h7 square to get some luft, the king steps into g6 with me. But black does have a defense. Black does have a defense. Well, queen c6 trick doesn't help. You just move the king away. Queen c5, Aquila got it. Queen c5 is the only move. Now, you might say, wait a second, we just moved the king with mate. How does this help? And if the queen takes the bishop, you promote with checkmate. Unfortunately, the queen takes the bishop with check, giving black enough time to squeeze the king into f8 and block the pawn. Black wins here. This happens no matter where you bring your king. If you bring it to g5, it's also check. You might say, let me promote first and distract the queen and then step aside with checkmate. But here there's another problem. You've given away the pawn and now the king has g8. Also queen g7 is possible. So what do we need to do here? Well, we have only one remaining approach. If we can't promote and we can't move our king, we have to move our bishop in order to renew the threat of king stepping away to e6 with mate. We can't move it here, we can't move it here. Let's say we bring it to b2. Let's say we bring it to b2. Or let's say we bring it all the way back to a1. Let's try to be as safe as possible. Now, again, we're threatening king e6 checkmate. And that's the only square that the king can possibly step aside to. So what is black's defense here? Again, I think you guys are thinking about black's defense in the wrong way. Giving the king a check doesn't help. It actually helps the king get to where it wants to go. You have to cover the square that the king is threatening to go to. And you can do that by involving the knight to c7, and it looks like white's in big trouble. Because the king now doesn't have a single square it can go to. White is stuck. And this is where, in my eyes, the real beauty of the study comes in. Bishop a1 is not the right move, by the way, but we'll get to the right move. And this is something you just kind of have to realize. Let's say for a second that it's black to play. Let's pass the move to black. Let's make a random bishop move, bishop b2. Does black have a single way to preserve the net against the king? Well, we know that if the knight moves, the king will have e6. That's why we brought it to c7. And after knight c3, we already know that bishop c3 is made. So the knight can't move. Can the queen move? No, it can't. If it gives a check on d6, the king has f5. Wherever the queen goes, white has either promotion or a king move with mate. If the h-pawn moves, again, we're already familiar with the mating idea, king g6. This means that black has only one possible piece that black can move. Queen f8 also gets mated with king f5, queen g7, and f8 queen. If queen c6, then anything mates, king e7. If queen f2, then again king e7 is mate. You have to remember that not only does the queen have to stop all of the king moves, but if the queen takes its eyes off of f8, this is going to be mate. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Black has to play a4. But black can run out of pawn moves. So what should white try to do here? White should try to get this pawn to exhaust itself, and then to take it with the bishop, and then that's going to lead to zugzwang. But then there's now another problem. The bishop doesn't have too many squares down this diagonal. It has to go back to a1. And unfortunately, after a3, it's white who's in zugzwang and not black. We have to give up our bishop, we lose. But in studies, you have to do this problem solving. Again, we spotted the right idea, but somewhere along the line, our execution was incorrect. Now, where was the execution incorrect? When did we have a choice? Yeah, Probum got it. We played bishop a1 because it looked safer, but now we realize that we have to go bishop b2 to get the move order right. Knight c7, bishop a1, a4, bishop b2, a3, and by contrast, it's black to move in this position. a2 is forced. We go bishop b2. Black has to promote. We take it. Black is in zugzwang and loses the game. Amazing, amazing position. And that's what makes all of the difference. Who create such puzzles? Matus. I mean, there are composers who create these kinds of puzzles. They are geniuses in their own right. And this guy wasn't a strong chess player. Composers aren't necessarily very strong players. I mean, he's probably 17, 1800. He died a couple of years ago. Yeah, this is a world most people are completely unaware exists. There are probably thousands of studies like this, you know, of this beauty. And not all studies are this beautiful, obviously. There's many bad studies. There's studies that are flawed. But nowadays, studies composed recently are always computer checked, so they're not going to be published unless they are correct. And studies have a very strict solving standard. So if a study has an alternate solution, the solution is called a cook. You say that the study is cooked. And that means it's a bad study. Like, you are not allowed to have multiple solutions to a study. It has to have one and only one solution at every critical move. So let me go through this one more time. You start with queen c8 to threaten bishop e7. You force the king to g8. Now you sacrifice the queen in order to get the bishop to this diagonal and threaten mate. The next stage is black trying to cover all of the king retreats, which would open up a discovered check. Knight c7. And now we force zugzwang by moving the bishop back and forth, forcing the a-pawn to give itself up. I'll give you guys one resource before I go on the topic of study solving. There's a website, arves.org, arves.org, which is kind of like the premier website for studies, and you can sort of browse. It has a bunch of like biographies of study composers, and for every composer, it basically has their top studies. That's a good place to start, and I'll think about that question more and maybe share other resources in future streams. But ARVES, arves.org. I don't know how to properly say it, but that's the bottom line. All right, guys, I gotta run. I gotta make a dinner, so I'm going to cut it off here. But I hope you enjoyed the study. And I'll definitely do more in the future. I think this is kind of a hit. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your evening. I'll probably stream tomorrow as well.